The wind was the first and last thing you knew on this stretch of prairie. It was born in the west, a phantom thing that gained substance as it scoured the plains, picking up grit and the ghosts of last year's grass. It howled a sermon of emptiness across land so flat and vast it could break a man's heart just by looking at it. The sun was a hammer, beating the color out of the sky until it was a pale, washed-out blue, and the earth below cracked like old pottery. Dust storms, they called them, but they were more like the land trying to fly away, to escape its own skin. Brown clouds boiled on the horizon, swallowing the sun whole and turning midday into a gritty, suffocating twilight. This was Eli's world. It was a kingdom of rotting fence posts, their cedar bones bleached silver and leaning like tired old men. The barbs of the wire were rusted fangs that snagged tumbleweeds and the occasional scrap of cloth. Remnants of someone else's failed dream. Rattlesnakes, the color of dust and patience, coiled in the meager shade of sagebrush, their dry rattle a whispered threat that was part of the landscape's chorus. Everything was sharp, brittle, and thirsty. The creek that cut through the north pasture was a scar of cracked mud, its water a memory from a wetter spring. The cattle, a scrawny herd of 20-odd longhorns, moved with the slow, resigned gait of creatures who understood that survival was a matter of endurance, not hope. Eli's ranch was little more than a testament to stubbornness. A small, sturdy cabin he'd built himself from cottonwood logs, a lean-to barn, and a corral that seemed to hold more dust than livestock. It was all he had left, all he wanted. He'd come here after the war, after the world had shown him the true nature of loyalty, which was to say, it had none. He was in his mid-30s, but the years had carved deeper lines into his face than his age suggested. He was a tall man, lean and corded with the kind of muscle that comes from labor, not sport. His movements were spare, efficient, born of a life lived alone where no energy could be wasted. The folks in Redemption, the small frontier town 10 miles east, knew him as a man of few words. They saw him when he rode in for supplies, his face shadowed by the brim of a stained hat. His eyes, a startling gray in his sun-darkened face, taking in everything and giving nothing back. They knew he'd fought for the Union, that he'd come back to find his family land sold, his brother gone, and his fiancée married to that same brother. It was an old story, the kind that festered in small towns, passed around over saloon tables and sewing circles. The betrayal had hollowed something out in Eli, leaving behind a quiet so profound it was like a physical presence. He didn't speak of it. He didn't need to. The solitude he wrapped himself in was answer enough. He tended his cattle, patched his fences, and watched the seasons burn across the prairie, content in the knowledge that the land, at least, was an honest enemy. It would kill you, but it would never lie. One morning, just as the sun was beginning its assault on the eastern horizon, he saw something by the north fence line. It was a heap of faded calico, a smudge of wrongness against the monotonous brown. He nudged his buckskin horse closer, his hand resting near the colt on his hip, a habit as natural as breathing. The land was full of surprises, and most of them were deadly. But this was no predator. It was a woman. She was collapsed against the lowest strand of wire, her body curled in on itself as if trying to shrink from the world. Her dress was torn and filthy, her hair a tangled mat of dark brown strands filled with burrs and dust. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft dirt. As he drew nearer, he saw the exhaustion that was more than sleep, the kind that bordered on death. Her face was pale beneath the grime, and a dark, ugly bruise bloomed across her cheekbone, stark and violent. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. She was half-starved, a bundle of sharp angles and desperate stillness. In one hand, she clutched a small, silver locket, her knuckles white from the force of her grip. It was the only clean thing about her. Eli knelt, his movement slow, the way he would approach a spooked mare. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Her eyes flickered open. They were a deep, haunted blue, and for a moment, they were utterly vacant. Then, a spark of terror ignited in them. She flinched, scrambling backward, and let out a dry, rasping sound that was not quite a scream. Her gaze darted around, looking for an escape she didn't have the strength to make. "Easy now," Eli said, holding up his empty hands. "I'm not gonna hurt you." He unhooked the canteen from his belt and held it out. "Water." She stared at it, her eyes wide with a feral distrust. He unscrewed the cap and set it on the ground a few feet from her, then backed away. He watched as she crawled toward it, her movements pained and stiff. She drank in greedy, desperate gulps, water spilling down her chin and soaking the front of her dress. When the canteen was empty, she let it fall, her head sinking to her chest as a tremor ran through her thin frame. She didn't look at him again. He knew he couldn't leave her there. The sun was already gathering its strength, and the buzzards would be circling by noon. With a sigh that seemed to pull up from the very soles of his boots, he walked toward her. She flinched again as he reached down, but there was no fight left in her. He lifted her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing, a bird with broken wings. As he carried her toward the cabin, her head lolled against his shoulder, and she fell into a dead faint, the silver locket still locked in her fist. He laid her on his own cot, the only bed in the one-room cabin. He cleaned her bruised face as gently as his calloused hands would allow, his touch clumsy but careful. He left a bowl of thin stew and a tin cup of water on the crate beside the bed, and then went about his chores. The quiet of the cabin now filled with the sound of another person's breathing. She didn't speak for 3 days. She would wake, eat the food he left for her, and then stare at the rough-hewn log walls, her expression unreadable. Eli gave her space. He slept on a bedroll by the cold hearth, rising before dawn and coming in long after dusk. He spoke to her only to say, "There's food," or "The water bucket's full." He didn't ask her name, or where she came from, or how she'd gotten that bruise. He knew what it was to have a past you didn't want to talk about. The silence in the cabin was different now, no longer empty, but heavy with unspoken things. On the 4th day, he rode into Redemption for supplies. The town was a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings that baked in the sun. He hitched his horse outside Abernathy's general store and went inside, the little bell over the door announcing his arrival with a cheerful jingle that felt out of place. Mr. Abernathy, a small man with a fringe of gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, greeted him from behind the counter. "Eli, been a while. The heat getting to you, or are you just too stubborn to admit you need civilizing?" "Just flour and salt," Eli said, placing a small pouch of coins on the counter. Abernathy measured out the flour, his movements brisk. "Heard some commotion from the west a few nights back. Sheriff Miller had to ride out to the old Johnson place. Seems a woman up and vanished. Her husband, Johnson. Well, they found him with his head bashed in. Ugly business." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Folks say she was trouble from the start. Never spoke a word to anyone in town, just stared right through you. They say she was cursed." Eli's face remained impassive. He gathered his supplies. "You be careful out there alone, Eli," Abernathy called after him. "This land attracts broken things." Eli didn't grace him with a response. Later, as he was loading his saddlebags, Sheriff Miller approached him. He was a big man, his gut straining the buttons of his shirt, his face perpetually flushed. "Eli," he said, nodding. "Saw your horse. Just wanted to give you a heads up. We're looking for a woman, dark hair, maybe 30 years old. Her husband turned up dead. Some folks in her town say she's not right in the head, prone to fits. If you see anyone wandering out your way, you let me know." "Haven't seen anyone," Eli lied, his voice flat. He swung himself into the saddle, the leather creaking under his weight. "You're a fool for staying out there," the sheriff said, shaking his head. That place of yours is nothing but a grave waiting to be filled." Eli just looked at him, his gray eyes as cold and empty as a winter sky. "We all end up in a grave, Sheriff. Some of us just don't need a crowd to see us off." He turned his horse and rode out of town, the dust rising behind him like a curtain. He knew the woman in his cabin was the one they were looking for. The knowledge settled in his gut like a stone, heavy and cold. He could turn her in. It would be the lawful thing to do. It would be the smart thing to do. But when he got back to the cabin and saw her standing on the porch, staring out at the endless prairie, a flicker of something other than fear in her eyes, he knew he wouldn't. He had seen the look on her face before, in the eyes of young soldiers who had seen too much, in the reflection in his own shaving mirror. It was the look of someone who had been pushed past the edge of the world and was trying to find their way back. As autumn deepened, the land traded its scorched palette for shades of gold and brown. The air grew crisp, and the nights carried the first hint of a chill. The woman, who he had started to think of as Clara, began to move about the ranch. At first, it was small things. She swept the cabin floor until it was spotless. She washed their tin plates in the basin, her movements slow and deliberate. Then one day, he came back from riding the fence line to find she had mended the tear in his best shirt, the stitches small and neat. She left it folded on his cot. They fell into a rhythm. He would do the heavy work, chopping wood, tending the cattle, repairing the barn roof. She took over the domestic chores. She started a small herb garden in a patch of protected earth by the cabin, tending it with a quiet devotion. She learned the patterns of his day without him ever saying a word, and would have a cup of hot coffee waiting for him when he came in from the cold. They still rarely spoke, but the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was a shared space, a quiet understanding. Sometimes they would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun bleed across the horizon, the vastness of the sky a comfort. In these moments, he would sometimes catch her tracing the outline of the locket she always wore around her neck. He never asked about it. He learned things about her in glimpses. He saw the way she would sometimes pause in her work, her hand going to her belly as a shadow passed over her face. He saw the way she recoiled from the sight of the axe when he split firewood, her eyes clouding over. He learned that the name inside the locket was Lily. He saw it one afternoon when the clasp came undone and it fell open on the table. Inside was a tiny, faded portrait of a small girl with wide, serious eyes. Clara snatched it up, her face pale, and retreated into her shell of silence for the rest of the day. He learned that her husband had not been a kind man. The proof was in the way she flinched if he moved too quickly, the way she never let him stand behind her. Their companionship was a fragile thing, built in the spaces between words. It was the way she handed him a warm biscuit in the morning, her fingers brushing his. It was the way he left a bucket of fresh well water by the door for her so she wouldn't have to work the pump. It was a language of gestures, of shared meals and quiet labor. For Eli, who had lived with only the ghosts of his past for company, it was a strange and unsettling comfort. He was a man who had made a fortress of his solitude, and he could feel the walls beginning to crumble, one small kindness at a time. Then the storm came. It rolled in from the northwest, a wall of bruised purple clouds that swallowed the daylight. The wind shrieked, tearing at the roof of the cabin, and the rain came down not in drops, but in solid, driving sheets. Eli secured the barn, his clothes soaked through in an instant, and fought his way back to the cabin, the wind trying to rip the door from his hands. Inside, the world was reduced to the small circle of light cast by the lantern. Clara was huddled by the hearth, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her body trembling. Every crack of thunder made her jump, her face tight with a terror that seemed to go beyond the storm itself. "It's just a squall," Eli said, his voice loud over the roar of the wind. "It'll pass." She didn't seem to hear him. She was staring into the fire, her eyes wide and dark. The storm raged on, each gust of wind a physical blow against their small shelter. The lantern flame flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The cabin, which had started to feel like a home, now felt like a cage. Suddenly, a sob broke from her, a raw, ragged sound that was torn from the depths of her soul. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Eli stood frozen for a moment, an intruder on a private grief he didn't understand. He slowly crossed the room and sat on the floor a few feet from her, not touching her, but just being there. He was like this storm, she whispered, her voice choked and broken. He'd come home roaring, full of whiskey and rage. The words began to spill out of her, a torrent of pain held back for too long. She spoke of a man whose love was a fist, of a life lived in fear, of a small daughter named Lily who had been taken by a fever 2 winters ago. She spoke of the locket, the only thing she had left of her child. That night, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, the sound of the rain on the roof a relentless drumbeat. He was drunk. He broke her picture. He threw the locket into the fire. He said he was glad she was gone. One less mouth to feed. She looked up at Eli, her blue eyes swimming with tears, a terrible clarity in them. I saw the fire iron lying in the hearth, and I just wanted him to be quiet. I just wanted the storm to stop. She didn't say what happened next. She didn't have to. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and terrible. She looked away, expecting him to recoil, to look at her with the disgust she'd seen in the eyes of everyone in her old town. She waited for the judgment, the condemnation. Eli was quiet for a long time, the only sounds the howl of the wind and the crackle of the fire. He looked at this broken woman, this killer, this survivor, and he did not see a monster. He saw the same haunted look he saw in his own reflection. He saw a soul pushed to its very edge. He finally stirred, reaching out to poke the fire with a piece of kindling, the flames leaping up to illuminate his weary face. "You're not the first ghost who's eaten at my table," he said, his voice low and steady, a calm anchor in the raging storm. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something deeper. It was acceptance. Clara stared at him, a tremor running through her. The storm outside continued its assault, but inside the small cabin, for the first time in a long time, the world felt quiet. The rain was just rain. The wind was just wind. And she was no longer alone with her ghosts. Winter did not arrive gently. It descended upon the prairie like a judgment, stripping the last vestiges of gold from the cottonwoods and leaving their branches stark and skeletal against a sky the color of lead. The wind changed its tune from a lonesome howl to a high, vicious shriek, driving pellets of sleet that stung the skin and rattled against the cabin walls. The world shrank, the vast horizon dissolving into a swirling curtain of gray. A profound cold settled into the earth, freezing the cracked mud of the creek beds solid and turning the water in the trough to a thick pane of ice that had to be broken with an axe every morning. Inside the cabin, the fight against the cold was a constant battle. Ice feathered on the inside of the window panes, and a draft snaked under the door, chilling the floorboards. Their stockpile of firewood, which had seemed immense in the autumn, was dwindling at an alarming rate. So too were their supplies. The flour sack was worryingly light. The coffee was nearly gone, and the salt was being rationed. Clara had developed a persistent, dry cough, a small, rattling sound that seemed to echo the cabin's own vulnerability against the relentless winter. Eli knew he could not put it off any longer. He had to go to redemption. He chose a day when the wind had momentarily exhausted itself, leaving behind a world hushed and buried under a thin blanket of snow. The air was so cold it felt sharp in the lungs. He saddled his horse, the creak of the leather abnormally loud in the stillness. Clara stood at the doorway, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her face pale. "Be careful, Eli," she said, her breath turning to a white plume in the frigid air. He just nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than usual. The quiet companionship they had built felt fragile now, a small flame flickering against the immense, encroaching cold. He handed her his spare pistol. "Keep the door barred." She took it, her small hand closing around the heavy steel. Their fingers brushed, a brief spark of warmth. And then he was gone, riding into the white emptiness. The 10 miles to redemption felt like 100. The town, when he finally reached it, seemed hunkered down, braced against the season. Smoke curled from every chimney, the only sign of life on the deserted street. He tied his horse outside the saloon, the promise of warmth and a hot meal overriding his usual aversion to the place. The inn was thick with the smell of stale beer, wet wool, and wood smoke. A few ranchers and town merchants were gathered around the pot-bellied stove, their voices a low murmur. Eli took a small table in the corner, nursing a cup of bitter coffee, content to be ignored, but the conversation from the men by the stove drifted his way, carried on the warm air. It was Sheriff Miller and the town's preacher, Reverend Davis. "A terrible business," the preacher was saying, his voice unctuous and self-important. "A sacred covenant, a marriage, profaned by a disobedient and wicked girl." Sheriff Miller sighed, rubbing his ample belly. "All I know is Silas Croft is one of the most important men in this town, and he's out a good deal of money. Paid her passage all the way from back east. Says she was a thief and a liar from the moment she stepped off the stagecoach. He was offering her a respectable life," the preacher intoned. "A home, salvation from whatever gutter she crawled out of, and how does she repay his Christian charity? She flees in the night like a common criminal, taking a silver locket that belonged to his sainted mother." Eli's hands tightened around his coffee cup. He kept his head down, his hat brim shadowing his face. "Croft says she's a slip of a thing, but feral," the sheriff continued, oblivious. "Warned me she's likely armed. He's put up a reward for her return, $50, a tidy sum for a runaway mail-order bride. She will face the judgment of man, and then a far greater judgment in the hereafter," the preacher concluded with grim satisfaction. Eli finished his coffee, paid for his supplies at Abernathy's, and bought a small bottle of cough syrup. He had no intention of lingering. The town felt suffocating, its small-minded certainties more bitter than the winter wind. He planned to ride straight back, but as he led his horse from the livery, he decided to cut through the alley behind the inn. It was a shortcut, a way to avoid the main street. The alley was narrow, hemmed in by the high wooden walls of the buildings, and filled with frozen refuse and deep, treacherous shadows. That was where he found her. She was a small figure, hunched against the biting wind in the sliver of space between a rain barrel and the wall. She was trying to work the latch on the livery's back gate, her fingers clumsy with cold. A horse whinnied softly inside. In the dim light, he saw the glint of a knife in her hand as she tried to pry the rusted bolt. "That won't work," he said, his voice quiet but clear in the narrow space. She spun around, fast as a cat, the knife held out in front of her. Her face was a pale oval in the gloom, framed by a wild tangle of reddish-brown hair. She couldn't have been more than 20. There was a split in her lip, and a fresh, dark bruise was beginning to form high on her cheekbone, almost identical to the one Clara had worn. But where Clara's eyes had been haunted, this girl's burned with a defiant, cornered fire. "Get away from me!" she hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. Eli didn't move. He looked at her, at the desperation etched onto her young face, and a memory surfaced, sharp and clear. 2 winters ago, a different town. In Kansas, he had been passing through, his spirits at their lowest, the betrayal of his brother still a fresh, open wound. It was snowing, and he had seen a girl, barely more than a child, huddled in a doorway, shivering, her hand outstretched. She had the same fiery hair, the same fierce eyes. He had bought 2 loaves of bread from the baker and had given one to her without a word. He looked at the young woman in the alley, at the knife she held like a talisman against the world. "Kansas," he said. "Outside the bakery. It was snowing." Her eyes widened, the fire in them faltering for just a second. The hand holding the knife wavered. She stared at him, her brow furrowed in disbelief. "You," she whispered, the single word a breath of astonishment. "The bread." "You should put the knife away," he said calmly. "Sheriff Miller is looking for you. Silas Croft has put a price on your head." Her face hardened again. "Let him look. I'd rather freeze to death in this alley than go back to that man's house." "That's a likely outcome," Eli noted, his gaze moving from her thin coat to her worn-out boots. He thought of Clara, alone in the cabin. He thought of the extra pistol he'd given her. He thought of the vast, empty prairie and the folly of bringing another stray into his carefully guarded solitude. It was a fool's errand. It was inviting trouble to sit at his hearth. His better judgment screamed at him to turn around, to get on his horse and ride away, to forget he had ever seen her. But he couldn't forget the look in her eyes then, or now. He couldn't forget the ghost of the hungry child she had been. With a sigh that seemed to draw all the cold from the air into his lungs, he said, "There's a storm coming in tomorrow. A bad one. You won't survive it out here." He untied the bedroll from behind his saddle. "My ranch is 10 miles west. You can shelter there until the storm passes." She looked from him to the horse, then back again, her mind racing. She saw no pity in his face, only a kind of weary resignation. He was not offering salvation. He was offering a temporary reprieve. "Why?" she asked, her voice still laced with suspicion. "Because I have a long ride ahead of me, and I'm getting cold standing here," he said. He mounted his horse and held out a hand to her. After a long moment of hesitation, she tucked the knife into her boot and allowed him to pull her up to sit behind him. She was stiff and tense, her small body radiating a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. As they rode out of town, away from the judgmental eyes of redemption, she didn't say another word. The cabin was a pinprick of warm, yellow light in the growing dusk when they finally arrived. As Eli dismounted, the door opened and Clara stood silhouetted in the doorway, the pistol held loosely at her side. Her eyes went from Eli to the girl he was helping down from the horse. A stillness came over Clara's face, a shuddering of the tentative peace she had found. Her hand tightened on the gun. "It's just for a few days," Eli said, his voice low, directed at Clara. "Until the storm passes. Her name is Isabel." Isabel stood her ground, her chin held high, her eyes assessing Clara with a sharp, guarded intensity. The two women looked at each other across the frozen yard, two survivors from different shipwrecks, suddenly washed up on the same desolate shore. The days that followed were thick with a tension as cold and sharp as the air outside. The storm did indeed arrive, a blizzard that buried the world in a sea of white and locked the three of them together in the small cabin. The space, which had been a quiet sanctuary for two, now felt crowded and charged. Clara was wary, her movements quiet and withdrawn. She saw in Isabel not a refugee, but an intruder. This newcomer was young, pretty in a wild, untamed way, and she carried a spark that Clara felt had been extinguished in herself long ago. She watched the way Eli would sometimes look at Isabel, not with desire, but with a kind of troubled curiosity. A bitter, unfamiliar jealousy began to take root in the barren soil of her heart. Isabel, for her part, met Clara's reserved watchfulness with a prickly defiance. She saw Clara's quiet competence not as strength, but as a kind of surrender. She mocked her with a sharp tongue and a sarcastic wit that was her only armor. "Don't you ever get tired of it?" Isabel asked one afternoon, as Clara was silently mending one of Eli's shirts. Clara looked up, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "Tired of what?" "The silence," Isabel said, gesturing around the small cabin. "Sitting here like a ghost, waiting for him to come in. Don't you have anything to say?" "I say what needs to be said," Clara replied, her voice soft but firm. "That must make for short conversations," Isabel scoffed, turning to stare out the snow-streaked window. The conflict brewed in 100 small ways. A spoon dropped with a clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet. A log tossed onto the fire with too much force. They circled each other like wary animals, their shared space a battlefield of unspoken resentments and fears. Eli tried to stay distant, to remain an impartial observer in his own home. He spent most of his days in the barn, tending to the livestock or making unnecessary repairs. The rhythmic sound of his hammer a desperate attempt to impose order on the emotional chaos in the cabin. The tension mounted, a pressure building that had to find a release. One night, long after the cabin had grown dark and quiet, Eli was awakened by a sound. It was a soft, muffled sob. He sat up on his bedroll, his senses on high alert. The sound was coming from the corner where Isabel slept. He quietly rose and moved toward the faint sound, his bare feet silent on the cold floorboards. The moon had broken through the clouds, casting a pale, ethereal light through the window. In its glow, he could see Isabel. She was curled on her side, her face buried in a bundle of cloth, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He realized she was crying into a dress he had seen Clara wear, a simple gray wool that Clara had lent her. The sight of this fierce, sarcastic girl, so utterly broken and alone, struck a chord deep within him. He saw past the sharp edges to the raw wound beneath. "I wasn't meant to be someone's wife," she whispered into the folds of the dress, her voice a ragged, broken thing. "I was just meat to him, something he bought and owned." Eli stood frozen in the shadows, an unwilling witness to her private agony. He felt a profound, aching pity, and an equally profound sense of helplessness. He didn't know how to offer comfort. Words were clumsy tools he had long since abandoned. He backed away as silently as he had come, leaving her to her grief. But he had not been the only one to witness the moment. From the top of the short ladder that led to the small sleeping loft, Clara had been watching. She had been awakened by the same sound and had seen the whole scene unfold in the moonlight. She saw Isabel's desperate tears, and she heard her whispered confession. And in that moment, the jealousy and resentment she had felt dissolved, replaced by a wave of sharp, painful recognition. She saw not a rival, but a reflection. She saw another woman who had been treated as property, another soul who knew the particular horror of a man's casual cruelty. She saw a mirror of her own wounds. She waited until she heard Eli settle back onto his bedroll. Then she quietly descended the ladder. She moved to the hearth and stirred the embers, adding a small piece of wood. She filled a tin cup with water and set it near the growing warmth to heat, dropping in a pinch of the mint from her herb garden, which she kept dried in a small jar. Isabel had cried herself into a state of raw exhaustion. She flinched when she felt a hand on her shoulder. She looked up to see Clara kneeling beside her, her face soft in the firelight. Clara didn't say anything. She simply held out a clean, worn nightgown of her own. Then she offered her the cup of warm, fragrant tea. Isabel stared at her, her tear-streaked face a mask of confusion. She took the nightgown, the soft flannel a comfort against her cold skin. She accepted the cup, its warmth seeping into her frozen hands. "He hurt you?" Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a shared truth that needed no explanation. Isabel looked down into the steaming cup, and a single tear she thought she didn't have left splashed into the tea. She nodded. Clara reached out and, with a tentative hand, brushed a stray strand of hair from Isabel's forehead. It was a simple gesture, but in the quiet, firelit cabin, surrounded by the vast, indifferent winter, it was everything. It was an armistice. It was the beginning of a thaw. The two women sat in silence as the fire crackled, the unspoken pain between them finally beginning to find a voice. Spring arrived not as an event, but as a slow, deliberate surrender. The iron grip of winter loosened its hold finger by finger, The process began as a sound, a persistent, gentle dripping from the eaves of the cabin. Then it became a smell, the rich, intoxicating scent of wet earth waking from its frozen slumber. The snow receded in ragged patches, revealing the pale, flattened grass beneath, and soon a faint green haze appeared on the distant prairie, a promise whispered on the warming wind. The creek began to flow again, first a trickle, then a gurgling stream, its voice a cheerful counterpoint to the months of silence. The thaw inside the cabin was just as gradual, just as profound. The oppressive confinement of the blizzard gave way to the shared purpose of work. A rhythm established itself, dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. They moved as one body with three parts, a silent choreography learned through proximity and necessity. In the morning, Eli would ride out to check on the cattle, which were thin and weary but had survived the winter, while Clara and Isabel tended to the chores inside. In the afternoons, they worked together. They replaced the rotting fence posts Eli had marked in the fall, their movements falling into an easy syncopation. The thud of Eli's sledgehammer driving a post, the scrape of Isabel's shovel clearing the next hole, the quiet hum of Clara as she stretched the new wire. They replanted Clara's herb garden, their hands moving through the dark, rich soil. Isabel, who had a surprising knowledge of plants gleaned from a nomadic childhood, showed Clara which wild roots could be used to make a bitter but effective tonic for her lingering cough. Clara, in turn, taught Isabel the slow, meditative process of kneading bread, her patient hands guiding Isabel's restless ones until the dough was smooth and pliant. The ranch, once a monument to one man's solitude, began to feel like a home. The cabin was filled with the scent of baking bread and drying herbs. Laughter, a sound Eli had not heard in years, began to echo off the log walls, usually sparked by Isabel's sharp wit, which had lost its defensive edge and now served as a source of light. But as the land opened up, so too did the path to the outside world. When Eli rode into Redemption for seed and other supplies, he felt a change in the air. The usual gruff nods from the other men were replaced with sideways glances and hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when he drew near. At Abernathy's store, Mrs. Abernathy, a woman whose face was a permanent knot of disapproval, served him with a pursed-lipped silence, her eyes flicking past him as if he were a stain on her clean floor. The gossip had taken root and flourished in the fertile ground of small-town suspicion. He could almost hear the whispers trailing in his wake. "That cowboy's keeping two women out there. Ain't natural." The words were a brand, marking him, marking them, as something other, something to be judged. The weight of it settled on him, heavy and suffocating. His honor, the one thing he had rebuilt from the wreckage of his past, felt tarnished. He was a man who lived by a simple, rigid code. He protected those who needed it. He did not take advantage. And in the eyes of the world, he was doing exactly that. He was keeping two vulnerable women in a compromising situation, exposing them to shame and ruin. The thought gnawed at him, poisoning the simple peace they had built. He finally confronted them one evening as the sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. He found them by the corral, leaning against the fence, their heads close together as they talked in low tones. They looked up as he approached, their faces open and untroubled, and the sight of it only twisted the knot in his gut tighter. "We need to talk," he said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual quiet warmth. They followed him into the cabin, the sudden tension a palpable thing in the small space. He stood by the hearth, unable to look at them, his hands clenched at his sides. "I've been to town," he began, his gaze fixed on a crack in the floorboards. "The talk, it's what you'd expect. They think this is improper." He finally forced himself to look at them, his gray eyes filled with a deep, troubled anguish. "I brought you both here to keep you safe, but I'm bringing shame on you. I'm dishonoring you both." Clara and Isabel exchanged a quick, unreadable glance. "I'll take you wherever you want to go," he continued, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. I've got some money saved, enough to get you settled in a real town, somewhere far from here where no one knows you. You could find work, find respectable lives. He was offering them a future, a clean slate. The only honorable solution he could see, he was offering to set them free, even though the thought of the silence that would descend on this cabin again was a physical pain. Clara was the first to speak. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the heavy air with absolute clarity. "And what about you, Eli? Will you be respectable then? All alone out here with your honor?" Before he could answer, Isabel stepped forward, her eyes flashing. "Respectable? You mean like Silas Croft? Is that the kind of life you think we're looking for, to be someone's respectable property until they decide to break you?" "That's not what I meant," he said, his voice strained. I want you to be safe, to be free from this." "This is the only place I've ever felt safe," Clara said softly. "The only place I've felt free." Eli shook his head, a man trapped in a cage of his own making. "It can't continue. It's not right." He turned and walked out of the cabin, unable to bear the look in their eyes. He went to the barn, the familiar sense of hay and leather a small comfort. He picked up a harness, his hands needing a task, something to fix. A few minutes later, Clara followed him in. The last light of day filtered through the gaps in the barn walls, striping the dusty air with gold. She walked up to him and gently took the piece of leather from his hands, setting it aside. She placed her hands on his chest, her touch a brand through his worn shirt. "You are a good man, Eli," she whispered, looking up at his tormented face. "You are the most honorable man I have ever known, but your idea of honor is a cold, lonely thing." She rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was not one of passion, but of profound, aching tenderness. It was a plea, a declaration. When she pulled back, her eyes were shining with unshed tears. "I don't want you to be faithful," she whispered, her breath warm against his skin. "Not if it means leaving us behind." The week that followed was a slow, agonizing dance of unspoken desires and unbearable tension. Clara's kiss had shattered Eli's resolve, leaving him adrift on a sea of confusion. He did not know what to do, what to feel. He only knew that the thought of them leaving was no longer a noble sacrifice, but an impossible loss. The true shift, however, happened not with him, but between the two women. One afternoon, as they were up in the hayloft spreading fresh straw, the air warm and sweet-smelling, Isabel fell silent. She sat down on a bale, her hands twisting in her lap. "Clara," she began, her voice unusually hesitant, "there's something I need to say, and I'm afraid it's going to break everything." Clara sat beside her, her expression patient, waiting. "When I first came here," Isabel continued, her gaze fixed on her own restless hands, "I was so jealous of you, of the quiet between you and him. I thought I would have to fight you for a place here." She finally looked up, her eyes bright with a fierce, vulnerable honesty. "But it's not like that. The safest I feel is when you're both in the room, when I hear his boots on the porch and your dress rustling by the fire." She took a shaky breath. "The truth is, I think I'm in love with both of you." The confession hung in the warm, dusty air of the hayloft. Clara's face crumpled, and a single tear traced a path through the light dusting of chaff on her cheek. She reached out and took Isabel's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Me too," she whispered, the words a sob of relief and recognition. The shared grief for the love they had never known, the shared terror of the pain they had endured, melted into something else. It was a moment of pure, unadorned truth. Isabel leaned her head on Clara's shoulder, and Clara wrapped an arm around her. There in the hayloft, surrounded by the scent of summer and the promise of a harvest, they found solace not in a man's protection, but in each other's arms. Tentative touches became a gentle caress. A shared sigh became a soft kiss on a tear-stained cheek. It was a new language of longing and healing, a tenderness born not of passion, but of a desperate, shared humanity. Later that evening, Eli came looking for them. He climbed the ladder to the hayloft to tell them supper was ready and froze on the top rung, in the soft bed of hay. Curled together like two stray kittens seeking warmth were Clara and Isabel, fast asleep in each other's arms. They were both wearing his old work shirts, the soft, faded flannel absurdly large on their small frames. They looked peaceful, safe, and utterly, completely gone from him, together in a world he could not enter. A tremor ran through his hands. He backed down the ladder as silently as he had come and walked out of the barn into the gathering dusk, his heart a wild, chaotic drum in his chest. He began to avoid them. He took his meals on the porch. He found endless tasks that kept him out of the cabin until long after they had retired to their beds. Isabel in the loft, Clara on the cot. He began chopping wood with a feverish, obsessive energy, the rhythmic thud of the axe against oak the only outlet for the storm raging inside him. The wood pile grew to a prodigious size, a monument to his turmoil. The women, in turn, seemed to have reached a quiet accord. They began to joke between themselves, their whispers and shared smiles a new, exclusive language. Sometimes, he would overhear snippets as he passed the window. "He's chopped enough wood for 3 winters, Isabel would murmur, a laugh in her voice. "He's afraid to be idle." And Clara would reply, her voice soft, "He doesn't know what to do with his hands." Once, he heard Isabel say, "We'll just have to share him." And the sound of their shared laughter was like a physical blow. The breaking point came with the thunder, a summer storm, much like the one that had broken Clara's silence months before, rolled in one evening without warning. The sky turned a bruised, angry purple, and the air grew thick and heavy. The 3 of them were in the barn, finishing the evening milking, when the heavens opened up. The rain came down in a solid, deafening roar, turning the yard into a river of mud. They were trapped. The barn was dark, lit only by the flickering yellow light of a single lantern and the brilliant, momentary flashes of lightning that illuminated the scene in stark, ghostly detail. The roar of the rain and the crack of the thunder were immense, trapping them in a small, chaotic bubble of sound and light, soaked and trembling, from the cold, from the storm, from the unbearable, unspoken thing between them. They stood in the central aisle, the scent of rain, wet earth, and animals thick around them. The truths finally spilled out, torn from them by the fury of the storm. "I can't do this," Eli said, his voice ragged, shouting to be heard over the deluge. "I don't know what this is. It's a sin. It's madness." "Is it a sin to be safe?" Isabel's voice shot back, sharp and clear. "Is it madness to not want to be alone?" "This is not how it's supposed to be," he yelled, running a hand through his wet hair, his face a mask of agony. "A man chooses one. He is faithful. He provides. That is the way. That is the law." "We are not asking you to break your faith," Clara said, her voice a low, calming undercurrent in the chaos. She stepped toward him, her eyes holding his in the flickering light. "We are asking you to see that your faith belongs to us, to this, here." She reached out and took his large, calloused hands, her own small ones trembling slightly. She brought them to her waist, pressing his palms against the damp fabric of her dress. "You don't have to choose," she said, her voice shaking with the force of her conviction. Isabel moved to his other side, her presence a spark of heat in the cold air. She looked him directly in the eye, her own gaze unwavering. "We already have." The storm raged around them, but in the small circle of lantern light, the world fell silent. There was only the sound of their breathing, the feel of Clara's waist under his hands, the heat of Isabel's body beside him. The choice was not his to make. It had already been made. He looked from Clara's face, etched with a deep and trusting love, to Isabel's, fierce and defiant and vulnerable. The rigid pillars of his honor, of the law, of the world he knew, crumbled to dust. Their first night together was not a storm of passion, but the quiet after. It was slow, trembling, illuminated by the lantern turned down low. It was full of tears. His, hers, theirs, a flood of past pains and lonely years finally allowed to wash away. It was a night of tenderness, of rediscovering the topography of another's body not as a thing to be taken, but as a map of survival. Each touch was a question, each kiss an answer, haunted by the ghosts of betrayal and brutality. They found in each other's arms a rare and fragile thing, the burning, defiant chance at connection. The fire in the hearth stayed lit, a steady, bright warmth against the darkness, beneath the endless, watching stars. The passing of the seasons brought a new kind of quiet to the ranch. It was not the hollow silence of solitude Eli had once known, nor the tense, brittle quiet of the winter with Isabel. It was a deeper, more settled peace, a harmony woven from the threads of their three distinct lives. They had navigated the awkward geography of their new arrangement, finding a balance in the small, unspoken ways of a family. Their days were filled with the rhythm of shared labor, and their nights were a quiet exploration of a love that had no name and followed no rules. The unspoken tension that lingered was not between them, but with the world outside. It was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of their contentment, a shared awareness that their small island of peace was surrounded by a hostile sea. They were a puzzle that defied the simple arithmetic of the world, and they knew it. But within the weathered walls of the cabin and the seemingly endless expanse of their land, they found a way to live. Clara, in her quiet way, was the anchor. One afternoon, she sat on the porch with a needle and thread, and by evening, she had finished her project. She laid 3 matching pillowcases on the bed they now shared. They were made from a simple bolt of calico, small blue flowers on a field of white. But the stitches were neat and strong. It was a simple, domestic act, yet it was a profound declaration. 3 pillows, side by side, 1 home, 1 family. Isabel brought them music. She had traded a jar of Clara's mint preserves with a traveling tinker for a battered, hornless phonograph that had been salvaged from a burned-out homestead. It was broken, the hand crank stiff and the gears prone to slipping. But with Eli's patient oiling and Isabel's stubborn coaxing, they managed to make it work. They had only 1 record, a scratched waltz that played at a lurching, melancholy tempo. One evening, Isabel pulled a reluctant Eli to his feet in the small, cleared space in the cabin. She taught them to dance, her laughter bright and infectious as they stumbled through the steps. Clara joined in, her movements graceful and reserved, a quiet smile playing on her lips. They danced, the 3 of them, to the broken music, their shadows growing long and intertwined in the flickering lamplight. But the world does not long suffer that which it does not understand. The danger they had held at bay began to creep in, a shadow falling over their sun-drenched harmony. It started, as it often did, as a whisper in town. A new notice had been posted on the sheriff's board, right next to the usual bounties for wolves and wanted men. Eli saw it on a rare trip for salt and coffee. The paper was crisp and new, the printing stark and official. It was a reward. Posted by one Mr. Silas Croft for the return of his absconded fiancée, Isabel, and for the arrest of the man who had kidnapped her from his care and protection. The words were a calculated poison, twisting Eli's act of rescue into a crime. He was no longer a solitary rancher. He was a kidnapper, a thief. The $50 reward was enough to make desperate men curious, and curious men dangerous. He tore the notice from the board, crumpled it in his fist, and rode home with a cold knot of dread in his stomach. He did not have to wait long. A few weeks later, a stranger rode up to the ranch. He was not like the usual drifters who passed through. This man was dressed in a fine coat, his boots polished, a silver-tooled gun belt riding low on his hips. He had an easy smile and eyes that were a cold, flat gray, much like Eli's. But without the weariness, they held a chilling kind of patience. "Howdy," the man said, tipping his hat. He introduced himself as Cain. "I'm just a traveler, passing through. Wondered if I might trouble you for a drink from your well. My horse is parched." Eli's hand rested near his pistol. "The well is over there. Drink what you need and be on your way." The man's smile never faltered. He let his horse drink. All the while, his eyes roamed over the ranch, taking in the neat herb garden, the sound of two women's voices from inside the cabin, the 3 sets of laundry drying on the line. "A man is lucky to have such a fine, well-tended home," Cain said, his voice laced with a meaning that was anything but neighborly. "And good company to share it with. It seems—" He rode off as pleasantly as he had arrived, but Eli knew he would be back. Cain spent the next week in redemption, and the whispers followed him. He was a charming man, buying rounds of drinks at the saloon, sharing stories, and asking casual questions. He was a bounty hunter, they said, one of the best. He was patient. He learned their routines. He learned that Eli often spent the late afternoon checking the fences on the far side of the property, and that the women sometimes went down to the creek to gather watercress. One afternoon, Isabel was down by the creek, her basket half full, humming the tune of the broken waltz. The lazy drone of insects and the gentle murmur of the water were the only sounds. She did not hear him until he was right behind her. "A silver locket for your thoughts," Cain said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. Isabel spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. He stood there, smiling, blocking the path back to the cabin. "You've caused Mr. Croft a great deal of trouble, Isabel," he said, taking a slow step toward her. "He's a man of property, and you are his property. He wants you back." "I belong to no man," she spat, backing away, her hand reaching for the small knife she always kept tucked in her boot. Cain's smile vanished. He lunged, his hand shooting out and clamping around her wrist like a manacle. "That's where you're wrong." His grip was brutal, his fingers digging into her flesh. "You're just a commodity, and I'm here to collect—" A flash of movement from the cottonwoods on the bank caught his eye. He looked up, his expression of cruel triumph turning to one of surprise. Clara stood there, not 20 yards away. The heavy Winchester rifle that Eli kept by the door held steady in her hands, its stock pressed firmly against her shoulder. Her face was pale, but her eyes were filled with a cold, hard fire he had not expected. She had been on her way to join Isabel when she saw him. "Let her go," Clara said, her voice low and even, carrying clearly in the still afternoon air. Cain laughed, a short, ugly sound. He gave Isabel's wrist a vicious twist, making her cry out in pain. "Or what, little lady? You'll shoot me." The rifle cracked, the sound echoing flatly across the prairie. Cain yelled, a sharp cry of pain and disbelief, and stumbled backward, releasing Isabel. He looked down at his leg, where a dark stain was rapidly spreading across his trousers just above the knee. Clara had shot him. Isabel scrambled away from him, running to Clara, who stood her ground, the rifle already levered for another shot. Cain stared at them, his face a mask of fury and shock. He cursed, then dragged himself toward his horse, which was tethered nearby. By the time Eli galloped back, drawn by the sound of the shot, Cain was gone, and the sheriff's wagon was lumbering up the path. Cain had ridden straight to town, his story a potent cocktail of righteous indignation and wounded pride. He had been a traveler, he claimed, merely asking for directions, when he was set upon by 2 wild, ungodly women and shot without provocation by the man who held them captive. Sheriff Miller's face was grim as he surveyed the scene. He was followed by Reverend Davis, whose expression was one of sour condemnation. A small crowd of townsfolk had followed them out, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. "This has gone on long enough, Eli," the sheriff said, his voice heavy with authority. First, you harbor a fugitive. Now this, a man has been shot on your land. I don't care what the truth of it is. The town wants them gone. They're a blight, a source of trouble and sin." "Sin," the preacher echoed, stepping forward, his finger pointing at the two women who stood protectively beside Eli. "This is an abomination in the eyes of the Lord. A man living in filth with two women. It is a sickness, and it must be cleansed from this community." The crowd murmured in agreement. Their fear had found a voice, and it was a righteous one. They demanded the women be sent away, cast out for the good of the town. Eli looked at the angry, fearful faces. He looked at Clara, pale but resolute, and at Isabel, who was cradling her bruised wrist, her eyes blazing with a defiant fire. He saw his whole world, this fragile, beautiful thing they had built, about to be torn apart by the ignorance and prejudice of others. The law, which he had once revered, was a weapon being used against them. And in that moment, he knew there was only one thing he could do. He stepped in front of the women, shielding them with his body. He looked directly at the sheriff, his voice ringing with a desperate conviction that silenced the crowd. "They are not leaving," he said. "They are my wives." The words hung in the air. A shocking, impossible declaration. The preacher gasped. "Bigamy? That is a hanging offense. You are mad." "Then hang me," Eli said, his gaze unwavering. "But they will not leave this place." He turned to Clara and Isabel, his eyes pleading with them, begging them to understand. "Marry me," he whispered, his voice for them alone. "Both of you, if it keeps you here and safe, I'll swear it in front of God or hell." Clara looked at Isabel, a silent question passing between them. Isabel gave a single, sharp nod. Clara turned back to Eli, her hand finding his. "Yes," she said. That night, under the silver light of a full moon, they stood beneath the ancient cottonwood tree that grew by the creek. Their only witness was old Jedediah, a retired ranch hand who lived in a small dugout a few miles away. He was nearly 90 and had been blind for 20 years, a fact that seemed fitting to Eli. Jedediah could not see their transgression. He could only hear the truth in their voices. Eli, in his clean Sunday shirt, stood between them. They had no rings, no fine clothes. They had only the words, spoken into the vast, listening quiet of the prairie night. "I, Eli, take you, Clara, to be my wife," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he held her hand. "To protect and to cherish, for all my days." He then turned to Isabel, taking her hand. "I, Eli, take you, Isabel, to be my wife, to protect and to cherish, for all my days." They each in turn made their own simple vows, their voices soft but clear under the moonlit sky. Jedediah, his blind eyes milky and serene, simply nodded. "I have heard what I have heard," he rasped. "May God have mercy on us all." Later, back in the cabin, the world outside fell away. Clara and Isabel both wore simple white blouses, their hair brushed and shining in the lamplight. There was a solemnity to the night, a sense of a threshold crossed. As they lay down on the bed, one on each side of him, they brushed against him, the soft cotton of their blouses a whisper against his skin. Eli, the stoic cowboy who had not wept for his brother or his lost love, who had faced war and loss with a stone-faced resolve, broke down. He wept softly in the dark, not for sorrow, but for the overwhelming, impossible grace of it all. He was no longer a solitary man. He was a husband, twice over. He was home. The fragile peace they had built was as vulnerable to the elements as the land itself. Summer did not arrive as a gentle guest. It descended like a conquering army. The sun, which had coaxed the green from the earth, now turned on it with a relentless, punishing fury. Day after day, it beat down from a sky bleached to a brittle, hazy white, baking the very air until it shimmered with heat. The prairie, which had so recently been a sea of new grass, became a scorched and desolate landscape. The earth cracked, the fissures deep and gaping like wounds, and the topsoil turned to a fine, choking powder that rose in clouds with every gust of the hot, dry wind. The drought returned with a vengeance, a silent, creeping thief that stole the life from everything it touched. The grass turned to tinder, and the leaves on the ancient cottonwood by the creek curled at the edges, died, and fell, littering the ground in a mockery of autumn. The ranch began to suffer. The fence posts Eli and the women had set with such care in the spring loosened in the baked, shrinking earth. The well, their very lifeline, grew shallower each day. The rhythmic creak and splash of the pump was replaced by a hollow, rasping sound, and soon the water it produced was a muddy, brackish trickle. The cattle stood gaunt and listless in the meager shade of the barn, their ribs like washboards, their eyes dull with a thirsty patience. The oppressive heat mirrored a growing, unspoken tension within the cabin. A change had come over Clara. She moved with a new, deliberate slowness, a quiet, secretive smile sometimes gracing her lips as she went about her chores. There was a fragile, luminous quality to her, a sense of a precious secret being nurtured within. Eli and Isabel noticed it, saw the way her hand would drift to her belly, the new softness in her eyes. They treated her with a gentle, protective care, a silent acknowledgement of the hope that was taking root among them, a small, green shoot in the midst of the drought. But the land was a harsh and unforgiving place, and it did not suffer such fragile hopes gladly. The end came on a blistering afternoon when the air was too thick to breathe. It happened quietly, without drama or warning, in the stifling confines of the outhouse. It was a solitary, brutal agony, a private war fought and lost in the humming silence of the heat. Isabel found her an hour later. A prickle of unease had led her to search, and she found Clara collapsed on the rough plank floor, a crumpled heap of calico and despair. Her face was ashen, beaded with sweat, and her eyes were wide with a vacant, shattered look. The secret they had all nurtured was gone, washed away in a tide of pain and blood. Without a word, a sob, or a cry for help, Isabel's strength, born of a lifetime of emergencies, took over. She gathered Clara's limp form into her arms, surprised at how light she felt, and carried her back to the cabin, her own face a mask of grim determination. She laid Clara on the bed, cleaned her gently with a damp cloth, and covered her with a thin sheet. She did not call for Eli, who was miles away, struggling to deepen a seep in the dry creek bed. This was a grief too raw, too female, for him to see in its immediate, bloody aftermath. When Clara finally drifted into an exhausted, merciful sleep, Isabel sat in the chair beside the bed, her hands clenched in her lap, and kept a silent, fierce vigil. They did not tell Eli right away. When he returned at dusk, covered in dust and sweat, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion, they presented a united front of quiet normalcy. Isabel simply said that Clara was tired from the heat and was resting. It was a secret born of a terrible, female understanding, a desire to shield him, and perhaps themselves, from the stark finality of the truth. But a secret of that magnitude cannot be contained. It poisons the air. Guilt was the dust that settled on every surface of the cabin, the metallic taste of the water from the failing well. The silence that had once been a comfort now became a weapon. Clara pulled away from them both, retreating into a shell of grief so profound it was impenetrable. She would lie on the bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, her hands resting on her now empty womb. When she did speak, her words were laced with a desolate, chilling belief. "Maybe this is our punishment," she whispered to Isabel one evening, her voice a dry rustle of sound. "For how we live, for our sin, God has scorched the land, and he has taken the child." Isabel tried to argue, her own heart aching with a fierce, helpless anger. "That's not true, Clara. It's the heat. It's this cursed land. It has nothing to do with God." But Clara's guilt was a fever that could not be broken. She flinched from Eli's touch, turning her face to the wall when he tried to comfort her. Her withdrawal created a chasm between them, a cold, empty space on the bed they shared. Eli, a man utterly unequipped to navigate the labyrinth of such a profound sorrow, was lost. He knew only that the woman he loved was slipping away from him, and he did not know how to bring her back. One night, he knelt by the bed, his large, calloused hand reaching for hers. "Clara," he began, his voice rough with unshed tears. "We'll get through this. I've lost things before." He meant to build a bridge of shared experience, to show her she was not alone in her pain. But the words that came out were clumsy, misshapen things. He spoke of his brother, of the raw, festering wound of that long-ago betrayal. He spoke of how some wounds never truly heal, how they become a part of you, a ghost that sits at your table. He was trying to offer the only comfort he knew, the grim companionship of survival. But to Clara, lost in her own fresh hell, it sounded as if he was diminishing her loss, equating it with his own. She pulled her hand away, and the silence that followed was colder and more final than any angry word. Their fragile family was fracturing, the lines of love and trust strained to the breaking point. The ranch itself seemed to be collapsing in sympathy with their emotional ruin. As their grief turned inward, their attention turned from the land, and the drought took its toll. It was Isabel who finally broke the spell. She had watched the slow, agonizing disintegration, her heart torn between Clara's desolate grief and Eli's clumsy, pained confusion. She saw the ranch, their only sanctuary, falling into disrepair. One morning, she stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked out at their world. She saw the sagging fence, the thirsty cattle, the dust where a garden had been. She saw not just a failing ranch, but a surrender. And surrender was a luxury she had never been able to afford. She turned back into the cabin, her face set with a hard resolve. Clara was lying on the bed. Eli was staring into a cold hearth. "Enough," she said, her voice not loud, but filled with a low, fierce intensity that made them both look up. "Look at this place. Look at us. We are falling apart." She walked over to the bed and took Clara's hand, her grip firm. "I know you're hurting. Clara, we are all hurting. But if we let this break us, we will have nothing left." She then turned her fiery gaze on Eli. "And you, stop talking about your ghosts. We have a real one to deal with right now." She took a deep breath, her voice dropping, filled with the pragmatic wisdom of a survivor. "They are all waiting for this," she said, her gaze sweeping the room to include them all. "The town, the preacher, the law, they are waiting for us to fail. They are waiting for us to break. If we fall apart now, they'll come for us, and they will tear us to pieces. We have to fight, not for God, not for honor, but for this. For us." Her words were a bucket of cold, clear water, shocking them out of their stupor. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of something other than grief appeared in Clara's eyes. Eli looked at Isabel, seeing not the sharp-tongued girl he had found in an alley, but a leader, a general rallying her troops. Isabel took charge. She was the one who devised a system to ration the last of the clean water. She was the one who rode to their nearest neighbor, a taciturn German immigrant 5 miles away, and bartered a handful of Clara's dried herbs for 2 buckets of fresh milk for the weakest of their calves. She organized the work, setting them to the task of repairing the fence, one section at a time, forcing them back into the rhythm of labor. Work, she knew, was a kind of prayer. It was an antidote to despair. Slowly, painfully, they began to rebuild. They worked side by side under the relentless sun, their shared sweat and exhaustion a new kind of bond. The silence between them was no longer one of grief, but of shared purpose. One afternoon, as they sat in the shade of the barn, sharing a piece of dry bread and a canteen of lukewarm water, Clara finally broke. The tears came not in a storm, But as a quiet, steady rain, she turned and buried her face in Isabel's lap, and her body was racked with the great, silent sobs she had held back for so long. Isabel did not speak. She simply stroked Clara's hair, her own tears falling silently onto Clara's head. Eli, sitting on the other side, reached out and took Clara's free hand, his large, steady grip a silent anchor. He held on as she wept, his presence a solid, unwavering promise. In that moment, the chasm between them closed. They were not two women and a man, or a husband and his wives. They were simply three souls, huddled together, sharing an unbearable sorrow. That night, after the moon had risen, Eli led them out of the cabin. In his hands, he carried a small, beautifully carved cradle, no bigger than his two hands put together. He had made it in secret over the past week, in the quiet hours after the women were asleep, whittling it from a piece of soft cottonwood. It was his apology, his confession, his eulogy. They saddled the horses and rode out to the high ridge that overlooked the ranch. From there, they could see their whole world spread out below them, the small, dark shape of the cabin, the silver ribbon of the creek, the vast, moon-drenched prairie stretching out to the horizon. They chose a spot beneath a lone, gnarled cedar tree that had somehow survived a century of wind and drought. With his bare hands, Eli dug a small hole in the hard, dry earth. Clara gently wrapped the tiny cradle in a piece of her own white nightgown and placed it in the ground. They filled the hole together, their hands brushing in the cool dirt. They stood for a long time in silence, looking down at the small, unmarked grave. "We should give her a name," Clara whispered, her voice clear and steady in the quiet night. Isabel looked at Clara, then at Eli, and then out at the vast, difficult land that was their home. "Hope," she said. "Hope." The word hung in the cool night air, a fragile, defiant prayer. Eli put his arms around both of them, pulling them close. They stood there for a long time, a single, three-part silhouette against the starry sky. Clara leaned up and kissed him, a kiss of gratitude and forgiveness. Then Isabel kissed him, a kiss of fierce, unyielding loyalty. Finally, Clara and Isabel leaned into each other, their foreheads touching, a shared acknowledgement of the bond that had saved them all. It was a grim and tender sacrament under the starlight, a promise whispered without words. They had survived. The wind blew cold across the ridge, but it could not touch them. The years that followed did not pass in a straight line, but in a repeating circle of seasons, each leaving its own mark on the land and on them. Time became a blur of windstorms that threatened to peel the roof from the cabin, and bountiful harvests that filled their small root cellar. It was the rhythm of fevers that struck in the dead of winter, fought with Clara's herbal infusions and cool cloths on fevered brows, and the sound of Isabel's broken waltz lurching to life on warm summer nights. They moved through the cycles of planting and reaping, of mending and preserving, of life and the ever-present threat of death that was the prairie's signature. The land remained as harsh and unforgiving as ever, a constant adversary that demanded respect and resilience. But their home, the small ranch that had been a refuge, slowly transformed into something more. In the quiet corners of the county, it became a legend. The change did not happen all at once. It began, as most significant changes do, with a child, the blacksmith's son. A boy of 6 with a hacking cough that had lingered since the first frost was brought out to the ranch by his desperate mother. She had heard the whispers, the stories that had morphed over time from condemnation to a kind of grudging awe. She knew Clara tended an herb garden. With a mixture of fear and hope, she stood at their door, her son's small hand in hers. Clara did not preach or judge. She simply knelt, listened to the boy's rattling chest, and prepared a syrup of mullein and honey. She sent them home with a jar of it, asking for nothing in return. A week later, the boy's cough was gone. That small act of kindness was a seed. Soon, Other visitors came, always tentatively at first, as if approaching a mythical beast's lair. Children with bee stings or fevers, a rancher who had gashed his hand on barbed wire. They came for Clara's remedies, for her quiet, competent touch that healed without question or cost. Then the women began to arrive. They came alone, often at dusk, shadows seeking sanctuary. A young wife with a fresh bruise on her cheek, fleeing a husband whose love was measured in whiskey and rage. A girl cast out by her family for a sin of the flesh, with nowhere else to turn. They would stay for a night, a week, sometimes a month, sleeping on a pallet by the fire. Clara and Isabel would feed them, listen to their stories, and offer not pity, but the silent, powerful understanding of shared experience. They would leave as quietly as they had come, a little stronger, a little less alone, leaving behind a small token, a bit of lace, a sack of flour, a half-written poem. The ranch that the town had once called a den of iniquity had become its secret, silent confessional, a sanctuary for the very people the town's rigid morality had broken. The ultimate sign of the shifting tide came one autumn afternoon in the form of the sheriff's wife, Mrs. Miller. She arrived in her husband's buggy, a woman whose face was a testament to a hard life, and held out a jar of peach jam. "My well has gone sweet this year," she said, avoiding their eyes, her voice stiff with the effort of crossing a social chasm. "We have more than we can use." It was a simple offering, a gesture of peace, an acknowledgement that the laws of neighborliness were, perhaps, more important than the laws on the books. From that day on, the invisible wall between the ranch and the town of Redemption had a gate in it. The legend of the cowboy with two brides grew, carried by traveling merchants and lonely cowboys. It was a story told around campfires and in far-flung saloons, a piece of folklore from a wild and strange land. And eventually, that story found its way into the hands of a man who dealt in such things. He was a reporter from a big city newspaper back east, a man named Thomas Hayes. He was a dapper, inquisitive man with a notebook full of questions and an insatiable curiosity for the oddities of the American frontier. He rode out to the ranch one day, his city clothes a stark contrast to the dusty landscape, and introduced himself with a polite, professional air. He was intrigued, he said, by their unique family. He wanted to tell their story to the world. Eli met the request with a flat, instant refusal. He stood on the porch, his arms crossed, his face a granite mask of privacy. "There's no story here," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "This is our home. It's not for sale." He had fought too long and too hard to protect this small circle of peace, to see it turned into a spectacle for the amusement of strangers. But after Eli had gone back to the barn, his disapproval a silent, thunderous cloud. Clara and Isabel called Mr. Hayes back. They invited him to sit on the porch, and Clara brought him a glass of cool water from the well. "Eli is a private man," Clara explained, her voice soft. "He has built walls to keep the world out, because the world has not been kind to him." "But we will talk to you," Isabel said, her gaze direct and unflinching, "because silence is what the world uses to shame people like us. We are not ashamed." And so they told their story, not the lurid, sensational tale the reporter was likely expecting, but the simple, unadorned truth. They spoke of loneliness and fear, of cruelty and desperation. They spoke of finding safety not in the laws of God or man, but in the quiet, daily practice of kindness. They did not speak of sin or salvation. They spoke of fixing fences, of planting herbs, of dancing to broken music. They described their life not as a rebellion, but as a refuge. Their honesty was a force, more powerful than any sermon, more compelling than any scandal. The story, when it was printed, was a sensation. It was read in parlors in Boston and boarding houses in San Francisco. And just as they were a puzzle to the town of Redemption, they became a puzzle to the nation. The story stirred a storm of outrage from pulpits and city councils, who saw in their family a threat to the very foundations of civilization. They were denounced as heathens, degenerates, a symptom of the moral decay of the frontier. But the story also stirred something else. For every letter of condemnation printed in the papers, there was another of quiet, thoughtful admiration. Women wrote of feeling trapped in their own respectable lives. Men wrote of the crushing loneliness of the West. Philosophers and poets saw in their simple story a radical, uniquely American kind of freedom. They had, without intending to, become a symbol. The official world, however, does not deal in symbols. It deals in laws. A month after the story was published, a letter arrived. It bore the official seal of a territorial judge from the capital city, a man they had never met, who lived in a world of brick buildings and paved streets. The letter was cold, formal, and brutal. It informed Eli that a formal complaint of bigamy, a serious felony, had been filed against him. It stated that their cohabitation was a public nuisance and an offense against the moral order. It threatened him with arrest, prosecution, and a long prison sentence. It was the voice of the outside world, finally coming to crush the small, strange flower they had cultivated in the wilderness. They read the letter together in the quiet of the cabin, the single sheet of paper feeling heavier than a tombstone. The old fear, the one they thought they had buried, resurfaced. The world they had so carefully kept at bay was now poised to tear its way in. But they had not accounted for the town. The news of the judge's letter spread through Redemption like a prairie fire, and the people of the town, who had once cast stones of judgment, now did a remarkable thing. They began to write letters of their own. Sheriff Miller, a man who lived by the letter of the law, wrote a clumsy, heartfelt defense. He wrote that while the family on the old Eli ranch was unconventional, they had never caused a bit of trouble. In fact, he wrote, they had solved more trouble than they caused, taking in the town's outcasts and healing its sick Mrs. Abernathy. The merchant's wife, who had once looked at Eli with such disdain, wrote a surprisingly eloquent letter describing Clara's kindness to the blacksmith's son. The German immigrant, who lived 5 miles away, wrote of how they had shared their meager water supply during the last drought. Letter after letter was sent, a flood of small, personal testimonies from the people who knew them not as a symbol or a scandal, but as neighbors. They were a petition of character, a testament to a different kind of law, one written in daily acts of decency. The town that had once tried to cast them out now circled around them, a stubborn, unlikely wall of protection. The final scene of their lives played out not in a courtroom, but on the porch of their cabin, many years later. Time had etched its story onto their faces. Eli's hair was the color of snow, his hands gnarled with arthritis, but his gray eyes were clear and calm. Clara was a gentle, silver-haired matriarch, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, each one earned through worry and laughter. Isabel's fiery hair was streaked with gray, but the spark in her eyes had never dimmed. It had simply softened into a warm, steady glow. They sat together on the porch swing in the fading light of a summer evening, a comfortable, familiar tangle of limbs. Isabel was reading aloud from a letter they had received from a woman in a distant city, a woman who had read their story years ago and was inspired to leave her own unhappy life. Isabel's voice was a low, contented murmur in the twilight. She says here that she has finally found a life of her own. She says she thinks of us often and hopes that we are well. Isabel folded the letter and looked at the two people who were her whole world. A slow smile spread across her face. She ends the letter by saying, "I know that in the eyes of the world, you live in sin, but I pray you sleep in peace." "We do," Clara whispered, and she leaned over to press a soft, dry kiss to Eli's temple. Isabel lay her head back on Eli's shoulder, her hand finding Clara's. They sat there as night fell, the first stars beginning to prick the deep purple sky. The wind, their old and constant companion, began its nightly howl across the endless plains, a lonely, untamed sound. But inside the cabin behind them, the fire in the hearth was lit. It was a small point of light in the vast darkness. But it was steady, it was bright, and it was defiantly warm. Thank you for listening to our story. We encourage you to comment with where you are listening from, so we can all connect with one another. Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts with us in English.